YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to day 2 of my favorite top 5 favorite monster week. So today we're going to be looking at my 4th favorite types of monsters to use, and I guess this is sort of going to be a bit of a cheap kind of cop-out, and there's going to be a couple of these I'll be doing throughout the series. But I really wanted to kind of talk about. I kind of group all these together sort of as a tie for my favorites. And so the first video was about orcs and how much I love using those. This video is going to be all about powerful undead. And for me, large, powerful undead creatures have been a major part of my campaigns since I started first running Dungeons and Dragons, actually. So my top like 4 favorite undead creatures are all represented here. So the first one is the Death Knight. So I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of why I like it so much in a moment. There's also vampires, and then there's like the Lich, then the Lich. And I guess there's actually 5 monsters here, because another one that I really enjoyed is the Spawn of Caius from Dungeon Magazine when they did their Age of Worms stories. So the Age of Worms was a campaign from 1st to 20th level, and it revolved around Caius trying to ascend to become a god. Or, no, sorry, he had already become a god, but there was an error with the ritual, and he was actually, trapped. And the point of the Age of Worms was to have him released so that he can actually, unleash his fury on, the prime-material world. And it was a really awesome storyline. And the Spawn of Caius, and the Caius worms and all that stuff, played a pretty big role in that, and I just always really liked, the Spawn of Caius. This is the Disciple of Caius. This is a more powerful, more intelligent spawn creature, but this was always, like I said, it was a really cool concept. And what the Spawn of Caius is they're undead, but they've got these like green worms that kind of just writhe around their bodies and like in and out of their eye sockets, stuff like that, and it was pretty gross. But the worms can actually transfer onto an enemy and burrow in and slowly transform them into an undead abomination. So I always really liked that. I always thought that was really cool. Another creature that I had a lot of fun with when it came to running the Age of Worms was actually the Lich. And for me, the Lich is just a really cool, it means an undead dragon. How awesome is that? And in this campaign, the Age of Worms campaign, the undead dragon, the Lich, was Dragatha, who was just sort of mentioned on the map of the classic D&D adventure White Plume Mountain, and was basically the very first undead dragon, like an actual intelligent undead dragon. And so I had a really awesome encounter with Dragatha, and I've just always liked, the idea of Liches anyway, just, dragons that, even though they're super long-lived, some, fear their mortality enough that they'll still do what they can to, escape it and become, undead creatures. So, Liches, I haven't used them in every single campaign that I've run, but I do like to incorporate them as often as I can when it makes sense. Alright, so those ones kind of came from the Age of Worms storyline, which is, again, one of my favorite pre-written campaigns to ever run. But there's other undead creatures that I just really, really, really like, and I've designed or run a few different campaigns. Very few of them, unfortunately, were able to get to completion just due to like schedules and life events and stuff like that kind of getting in the way. But my 3 favorite undead creatures to use as major campaign villains are the Vampire, the Lich, and the Death Knight. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Vampire first. I've just always been, a big fan of the vampires in Dungeons and Dragons. I always liked the way that they were kind of structured with their abilities. They're not unable to cross running water, and, they always seemed really kind of interesting and well done, and always seemed to make for great, just villains in general. Ravenloft is one of the classic Dungeons and Dragons adventures, and I have the original First edition AD&D Ravenloft. I have the Realms of Terror box set for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. For 3.5, I have the Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, and for 5th edition, I have Curse of Strahd and the Curse of Strahd DM screen. So I just always like the idea of sort of like the brooding, manipulative vampire lord as a major villain. So those are creatures that I always also really liked using. So the last 2 that I want to talk about right now are Liches and Death Knights. And I'll actually talk about I'll talk about the Death Knight first. So for me, I always like to use Death Knights as much as possible. I just always thought that they were a really awesome monster. The sole reason I bought the third edition Monster Manual 2 was because they had Death Knights in them. Like, that's the main reason. That was the selling point that got me to buy that book. And otherwise, the book wasn't very good. But, it had Death Knights in it. But for me, my favorite thing about the Death Knight is not so much just using them as random monsters and just having them be like these undead, warriors and, things like that, which is kind of how they've started to go with, like, 3rd edition sort of onward. For me, I like the classic, like, 2nd edition or 1st edition, the AD&D Death Knights that I've seen, where they were essentially fallen paladins, and they were, these champions of just and good and, holy gods, and through certain series of events, they just ended up betraying everything they ever sort of held dear, and they completely broke any of their sacred vows, and the betrayal was so great that the gods actually punished them and turned them into Death Knights. So, like, a Death Knight used to be like a curse. It was something that was a bad thing to happen, and if something was turned into a Death Knight, it means that it was probably a pretty powerful champion of valor and holiness that ended up, like, just crashing and falling as far as you possibly can. Perfect example of the Death Knight that I'm kind of thinking about is Lord Soth from the Dragonlance series. And Dragonlance did a pretty consistent job, even in 3rd edition, of presenting Death Knights in that classic manner. So the thing with Death Knights is they were generally bound to a specific location. The location was either the place of their death or the place of their greatest betrayal, or their most painful memories, or something along those lines. And they, they could command undead, and they could do all these things, which was great. But the eerie thing about them is that I believe it was on every full moon, the night of a full moon, the Death Knight would actually sing the song of his great betrayal, and, like, sing the song of how he was cursed to become this undead creature. And it was just something that seems really unnerving. And I've just always liked that kind of creature. It's that kind of sort of like a tragic character with, more to them than just, I'm evil for the sake of being evil. And for me, half the fun of creating a Death Knight was trying to figure out just how they could have fallen, type of thing. So I've had a few different Death Knights that I've used in some of my earlier campaigns. My favorite one that I've ever created was Kanan. So Kanan was this divine champion. So again, he was this, holy paladin. And he basically just through all these, like, endless wars and conflicts and battles and things like that, he started to just become worn down by all the atrocities that he had seen committed in war in the name of his god, in particular. Just started to basically broke him, and it reached the point where he no longer needed war as a justification of doing these terrible things, just because, in his mind, he was always at war. So, if it took running into, slaughtering a village to defeat, a group of enemies to your religion, then, that's one thing. So he was always acting as if he was the hero, and even as an undead Death Knight, he always considered himself to be the hero, but he had just become so twisted and corrupted by the violence that he was a part of, as these, like, holy crusades had gone on. Another version that I had was of the Death Knight was Yseron. I think that was the name. I showed him. I think I showed the sheet that I had for the 20th level Incarnate, and with him, the idea was that he just developed these abilities as an Incarnate. So he had the ability to sort of, like, just collect soul energy from the ether and shape it into these physical objects that he could use to augment his abilities. And what was kind of interesting about that is I started to go off script from the book, and what he would end up starting to do is he kind of became more and more powerful. Using, like, the soul energy was something that he just started to become addicted to. And as when he actually rose to become the leader of a small nation through conquest and political maneuvering and things of that nature, he, as an intimidation tactic, would, if anyone wronged him or committed some sort of crime against his law and his rule, what he would do is publicly execute them and extract the souls of these individuals that he would meld into an object, one of his soul melds. So he would actually use the souls directly from these, prisoners, political prisoners, war prisoners, whatever you want to consider them to be, but people that basically were a threat to him. He would execute them in public to try to dissuade anyone else from trying to rise up similarly or do anything to, again, sort of undermine him. And again, it was just I thought it was just a great idea, or a cool idea, to have him use the soul of that individual and shape it into something in front of the crowd. So you make like his mantle sort of thing, which is kind of like a cloak. It's hard to go into all the specifics, but that's one of the things that he would do. His main things, so that was sort of the earliest version of him. And even though he started off as a relative hero, even from an early age, he would use the soul energy, and he would basically take the souls of people that he thought would wrong him. And that was one of the background things that the players were going to discover, is that his main soul meld, which is this one that gave him bonuses to like his strength and armor class and things like that. It took up his like armor slot, essentially. They were going to discover that that particular soul meld he's always had, and that was the first one that he really physically manifested in full. And as it turns out, the soul energy that he invested into that, or that he gathered to use for that soul meld, was from the souls of his parents. So, unbeknownst to people, he actually, as an adult, went back home. And the very first thing as he started to slide towards evil was he executed his parents and took their souls to make himself stronger. So I just thought that was sort of an interesting idea. So that's kind of the things that I've done with the Death Knight. But for me, again, I want the Death Knight to be kind of a more interesting or tragic character. I want there to have been like some good, and I always think it's interesting to have a villain who actually thinks that they're the hero. And for me, a Death Knight really kind of fills that void. The last enemy, or the last undead creature I want to talk about today, is the Lich. And Liches, for me, have always been my absolute top favorite go-to undead monster to have as like a campaign villain or a major threat in my like campaigns and adventures. The very first villain I ever created for a D&D campaign, even way back in 2nd edition, was this elven lich by the name of Elcar. And the thing about Elcar was E-L-C-A-R, not the most creative name, but for somebody who was just starting out, I thought it was alright. But the thing with him is that he wasn't so much evil as he was just bored. And so he would basically try to do things to get these adventurers to kind of like come after him, to go through his dungeons and kind of set it, like, make their way through all the traps and all the undead creatures that he's created, just for something to do. And a lot of times he would be like a very active villain in my games, and would, the party would run across him pretty early on, and even though he's had plenty of opportunities to kill them, he would never take it. He might incapacitate them, or he might just completely ignore them. Because mainly he's, he was thousands of years old at this point. Like, I think in the first campaign that I really fleshed him out for, and statted him out in full, was a 3rd edition campaign, actually. And it was my first 3rd edition campaign, and he was, I think, 3,000 years old at that point. So he had accomplished basically everything that he wanted to do with his immortality. So he wanted to, he conducted all the arcane research that he could. Like, he learned all the spells that were in, the 3rd edition D&D at the time, which was just like the core books were the only things out at this point. And he just got bored. So he would do what he could to get these, there are times that he would start the rumors that would get player characters, these adventuring heroes, to like invade his lair and try to take him out. And And I always thought it was just kind of an interesting idea, and I've always liked the idea of the Undead Wizard anyway. And for me, a really important thing that I like to be able to do in my campaigns is have reoccurring villains. And with the Lich, it's just naturally built in to be a reoccurring villain. Because even if the player characters defeat the Lich and destroy them, as long as their phylactery isn't destroyed, they can come back in just a few days. So it was one of those things that, he never really worried about being cautious or careful with anything because his phylactery wasn't stored anywhere near where his lair was. He, kept the two completely separate for good reason. And so it kind of got to the point where he just wanted people to come, and if they could defeat him and kill him and destroy him, then they deserved all the treasure that was in his lair. And if they defeated him in that lair, he would simply create another one over the next century or so, fill it with undead creatures, and go from there. So again, those are just some of my favorite undead creatures. I love undead. I've always enjoyed having and using undead in my campaigns. They're always one of my go-to creatures, and in most campaigns I want to have at least one of the Lich, Vampire, Death Knight, or Dracolich in my game. I try to incorporate at least one of those as a serious villain, if not for the entire campaign, at least for sort of like an offshoot side trek type of thing. So anyway, let me know in the comments below what you guys think of these powerful undead, and if there are any other undead that you prefer, like, say, for example, wraiths, wights, specters, ghosts. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think, and if you have any great stories about encountering these types of undead, or as a dungeon master, if you have any great stories about running encounters with these types of undead, let me know, because I would love to hear those stories. And again, as always, if you have a YouTube channel, or you want to start up a YouTube channel, and you want to talk about role-playing stuff, make a video response, and just kind of talk about some of your favorite monsters, favorite undead, humanoids, whatever, but let me know if you do that, and I would be more than happy to sit down and watch your video. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.